So, hi everybody, and thank you for coming. My name is Lina Džuverović, and I'm the organizer of this project. I am just going to start by asking people if they could mute their microphones because I'm getting some feedback here. And that's actually indeed one of the first points on my housekeeping agenda. So I just wanted to, first of all, welcome you, and then to say that, as you can probably see, this talk, like all the others in this series, is being recorded, and it will be uploaded onto the website of the project and also onto the Art Monthly website. So that's just for your information. The panel will last until approximately 8:30, give or take. And again, housekeeping, if you would like to ask a question while we are speaking, please either write it in the chat or keep it for when we open to the floor. So the idea is that the panelists will speak for approximately an hour. We will have a kind of a conversation drawing on our asynchronous conversations that we've been having for about 2 months now. And then at around 8 o'clock, we'll open to the floor. I would also like to invite anyone that's been part of this project, which I'll explain in a minute, and others, to join us in bringing in any issues or any topics or points that have come up in other conversations previous, because this is the fourth panel. Any participants and others that are here, please do join us, and please feel free to bring in anything that springs to mind, kind of in an attempt to perhaps join up a little bit the conversations across the floor. So while we're speaking in the first hour, please keep your mics and your cameras off, and then after that, please let's all have our microphone or our cameras on so that we can see each other. So that's on the housekeeping front. For those of you that have been coming to these events, as I said, this is the fourth one. This is going to be a bit repetitive, but I'm going to quite quickly say a few words about the project and just welcome you on behalf of BERMAC, which is the Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Media and Culture at Birkbeck, at the School of the Arts, based at 43 Gordon Square, but we're doing a lot of our work online at the moment, having learned from the pandemic how to do that. And BERMAC is a center that brings together the Department of Film, Media and Cultural Studies, the research from across the department, which includes arts policy and management, journalism, film, television, digital culture. So it's a very kind of broad cultural studies approach, and we try to bring in different perspectives through different topics and different strands that we organize. And I'm a co-director of this center together with Rebecca Cupid, who is also a lecturer in film, media and cultural studies, but could not be with us this evening. So I also just want to briefly thank everyone that's been involved in this project. First and foremost, all the participants, because this is the last panel. So I just want to really make sure that I get that across. It's been a fantastic process, and perhaps we can talk about that at the end, but also all the partners, which are Art Monthly, Electra, and the funder of the project, which is the Center for Human Rights and the Arts at Bard College, who funded this particular strand of conversations that we're having now, and Kat Black, who is the research assistant on the project. So I'm just going to say this time very briefly about the project itself and its preoccupations and kind of what brings us here, and then I will introduce the panelists and say a few words about this particular panel. So the project and others, the Gendered Practices and Politics of Art Collectives, has been running for about a couple of years. I started in around 2009, emerging from research into collectivity in the former Yugoslavia, and my observations that collectives and groups were mostly formed around a particular axis and were not particularly diverse. In other words, I was coming across a lot of male collectives, exclusively male collectives, or collectives that were identifying as a number of male names, but many female artists were also present and were also to be seen in works, in performances, in images. So I wanted to investigate these discrepancies and then moved forward from that into becoming more interested in methodologies around how we think about collectivity, how we research collectivity. In other words, how we think of those who are maybe not present, who are not the voice of collectives and groups that are working in art. And amongst other questions I've been asking, so this led me to a number of kind of overarching research questions, including questions of invisible forms of labor, different ways in which we value labor in collective practice, different voices and who is heard and seen and who isn't. Also questions of sort of engaging with studies of collectivity. I also noticed that these kind of questions are often glossed over. So I was very interested in really engaging with some of these issues and kind of developing a series of questions through a collaborative process. The process that we've gone through is that I have invited 17 participants who are writers, curators, artists, people working collectively, or people who have written about collectivity. And we have been discussing in the format of collaborative writing documents on a software called Framapad in 4 different panels or 4 different documents for about 2 months, responding to some prompts. And this is the 4th one of those. So we've been 4 or 5 people in each group. And tonight we are, I'm going to introduce 3 panelists, Helena Reckitt, Gerrie van Noord, and Chris McCormack. All the panelists are writers, editors, curators, educators in various configurations of those activities. And the panel this evening is entitled The Third Hand, Claire, Bernadette, and Friends. It will probably become obvious, if it isn't already, through our discussion what these names reference. But the third hand is a term from a book called The Third Hand by Charles Green, in which he proposes this idea that the kind of collective action or collective work can sometimes, in some cases, result in a new entity or the kind of transcend individuals within the collective, and a new entity is formed. So I took this term to investigate further, and we've been really talking about 2 things, really. The panel has kind of had 2 strands, one of which is investigating different strategies that artists have taken, whereby, as I said, the individuals are either obscured, invisible, or completely erased, and the work or the publicness is attached to a new persona or a new entity, often with a name that operates front for a collective action of sorts. And in a way, I've kind of posed, one of the prompts was to kind of ask whether these strategies, how successful these strategies are, and whether this may be, in some cases, a strategy of kind of beating the enemy at their own game by creating and commodifying a kind of creating an artist, a commodity that is a singular author, that is something that the art world can work with or can process or can kind of in turn co-opt in their own way. So whether this is kind of a play at this game. And then secondly, I have been quite sort of ambivalent about these strategies. I kind of have historically had a love-hate relationship with these kind of strategies, because I think on the one hand they open up a lot of possibilities and create new forms of agency, but on the other hand I think it's also in many cases very much an insider's game, and I sometimes think it may be the case of kind of creating an insider and outsider kind of relationship in terms of those in the know and those who are not. And just as an illustration, some groups that we're talking about here include Claire Fontaine, Bernadette Corporation, the Guerrilla Girls have been mentioned in our conversations, and many others. And so I won't say more about that. And the second strand, which weaves in also, is the form of collectivity or sort of working together, writing together, that happens in the process of editing. And this is really kind of given us a lot of food for thought. So the kind of questions of what voice is created through the process of editing, the role of editors, and the role of the editorial process, and the many ways in which we can think about it. So these were just some of the prompts that we started with. And at this point, I would like to pass over to our panelists. So starting with Helena, and then Gerrie, and then Chris, I'd like to ask you if you could just say a little bit about your own work and the way you see your work intersecting with the kind of questions that are being discussed in this panel. And secondly, if you could just say a little bit about how this experience of writing together or attempting to kind of weave all of these topics together has been for you. And then we'll come back to kind of delve in depth. So Helena.
Thanks, Lina. So just to clarify, do we talk about what we actually talked about? Or will that come later when we've done this first stage?
Yeah, I think let's do the first stage. If you could just talk about your kind of how you see your work and questions you've asked fitting into these conversations.
Thank you. So just to say first off, I don't consider myself to be a something. I don't consider myself to be a curator, a researcher, anything. I actually think there's a real danger in over-identifying with those roles. So I consider myself someone who has done various things, mainly in relation to contemporary art, and some of them have been things like editing and writing and teaching and curating. But I actually got this from a very brilliant woman called Laurence Russell, who's a Belgian woman who's currently directing an art school. And she says that she never calls herself, a director or a curator. And I thought that was just a really good way to remind us that we just occupy these roles, and that they shouldn't own us, and we shouldn't give up the rest of our lives that are not claimed by these professional identities. And in a funny way, I suppose that's kind of what led me to organize an exhibition. And I'm actually not quite sure why I was put on this particular panel. Maybe I'll ask you later, Lina, but I'm very, very interested in the overall theme of the gendered politics and practices of art collectives. I don't actually consider myself a particular specialist on the question of anonymity or assumed identities by artists and others. But I did curate an exhibition called Getting Rid of Ourselves, which sort of took on the phenomenon of branded identity. So artists who took part, most of them had assumed identities, such as Clairefontaine, who we talk about in our Frammapad discussion. So that's an artist identity comprising two individual artists and writers who work together, and then other people like Heath Bunting, who has done a lot to kind of problematize identity and its legal constraints. And really, this exhibition, Getting Rid of Ourselves, came out of my own dissatisfaction with how I felt I had to operate as someone who had a curatorial job in a public art gallery in Canada at that point. Because I really felt that I was having to kind of pimp myself. I was sort of having to pimp myself as somebody who could raise money, not because my projects were good, but because I was a kind of winnable commodity. And it was a real blurring of friendships and relationships that I might really enjoy, but which I felt were being instrumentalized for financial means. The real kind of penny dropped for me was when the development director, the person primarily responsible for fundraising, found out that I had a distant cousin who was married to a rich banker and insisted we invited them for lunch. And I just felt, supremely pimped. So that was kind of what led me to query this, I suppose, appropriation and instrumentalization are things that I held really dear. You know, the art, the curatorial projects I wanted to do, the artists I wanted to work with, the values that I held dear, but which were becoming instrumentalized. So this experience of working on this Framapad, I think what I've really enjoyed is being part of the overall project and attending. I wasn't able to come to the third session, but attending two of the others, and really the generosity that has been shared by the contributors, references, you know, even in the chat, people kind of really wanting to contribute to a shared discussion and not guarding their ideas and their citations, which I have experienced in other situations, as if we own them. We don't own any of them, and we're all a palimpsest of quotations, as I think Bart once said. So I've really enjoyed that really kind of polyvocal nature of this conversation. I was just looking back over our conversation, and actually it was really rich, but I think because I wasn't necessarily sure what I was bringing to it, I was a little bit anxious during it. But I'm interested to hear how Chris and Gerrie experienced the process.
I could respond, but let's move on. Okay, Gerrie, do you want to go next?
Thanks very much. This is really interesting to hear Helena articulate sort of how she sees herself, as in I've probably come in almost diametrically opposed, where I call myself an editor stroke curator of publications. And I started to do that a couple of years ago, and I'm also an educator, but that sort of combination of editor stroke curator of publications was really a provocation to myself, but also I think to the field, and it's something that I keep coming back to, and I now joke about in talks that I do about what I do in terms of an editor. I've produced lots of different publications. I've worked with lots of different artists, curators, writers, other editors, organisations on a broad variety of publications, from catalogues to artist books, from critical anthologies to peer-reviewed journals, and I'm on the cover of none of them. And for me, that sort of like tension point between, okay, I do a lot of the legwork here, guys, and I use guys in the gender neutral kind of form here, where it's like, okay, well, what are the kind of positions and what are the labels that we give positions that we hold within usually a very complex kind of network of positions and ways of working and relationships? Why do the kind of labels that we use put us in a particular kind of place and therefore sort of perception in other people's minds? So when I say editor, people immediately think, oh, you do something with books or journals or magazines. Whereas if I say I'm a curator of publications, then that for me opens up a spectrum of possibility to start to question the kind of terminologies that we use and the agency actually of certain types of language that circulate, that we all sort of like start to operate with the moment we enter a field. So that's sort of like a very broad introduction, sort of trying to narrow it down. So yes, I am an editor, but also do teaching a lot and have been doing for a long time. I mainly teach now, curating students. And I'm in that sense also very interested in discourse formation. Who contributes to the discourse? What are the kind of terminologies that circulate within the discourse? What are the terminologies that I see students pick up and sometimes very subconsciously feel clearly that they need to start using? Assumptions that they come at those terminologies with, that they feel have currency if they use this word, not that word, or that indicates something that they feel has a certain kind of currency or value. So I'm really interested in how, as editors and writers, teachers, curators, whatever position we hold or combination of positions, how we potentially also all contribute to the perpetuation of certain kind of hierarchies, where indeed certain work remains invisible, remains perceived as indeed subservient to other people's work. So that has led me in recent years to do a PhD really looking at, well, indeed, if we're looking at publications in relation to artistic and curatorial practice, what do notions of relationality between the practice and publications, what does that mean in terms of what is being carried over? But also, what does it mean in terms of authorship when we articulate with others something in relation to a practice, sometimes a whole body of practice, a whole career? What if I work with an artist and writers and a graphic designer on a project that tries to articulate something about that practice, but in the form of a publication, whether that is a website or a book, doesn't matter. What does that actually mean when we think about notions of collaboration and authorship? Who is that authored by? Or what different kinds of authorship maybe sit underneath that make this complex thing come into being. So I'm really sort of interested in broadening out the notions of, but also maybe bringing more nuance to the notion of collaboration. I think collaboration as such is a stopgap word that also precludes us from actually thinking, well, who collaborates with whom, for what purpose, in what other sets of collaborations are actually here at play, and what do those very complex time unfolding processes actually mean to what is being produced. I'm going to stop there because I could sort of carry on for quite a while here. I've probably already hinted at sort of some of the things that I've sort of have come out of the Framapat process. For me, I really enjoyed it, but also found it really difficult because, yes, we're all looking at screens all the time, and I think every panel has brought in the caveat, I wanted to contribute more. I think that was also the case certainly in my case. But I think there's an awful rich spectrum, including indeed some of the points that I've referenced. Indeed, what are the kind of terms that we use? What kind of barriers does that throw up? What are the kind of contacts that we think about when we think about collaboration? Where does that sort of have a certain kind of currency? Where does it become difficult to sustain that? So all those kind of things we can sort of discuss further, but I'm going to leave it at that.
Great, thank you. Chris, over to you.
Thank you. And I echo, I mean, I found Helena's point around being sort of recalcitrant or sort of withdrawing from these sort of definitions or labels quite appealing, particularly, you know, because we are always had to sort of reinstate and restate our identities for some degree of authenticity or some sort of degree of purchase over these subjects that we're handling, but often feel quite slippery and out of touch. And I think we'll talk about a lot of that kind of opacity or the way in which things remain outside of the, remain unmappable or outside of sort of tangible experience, partly because they're so relational. So I'll just say that I'm a writer and editor. I work for Art Monthly a lot. And alongside that, I've sort of contributed and written for numerous catalogues and essays over the past few years. Most recently for Charlotte Prodger, I did her monograph this year, which was, you know, a great experience. And someone I've worked with over the past 7 or 8 years. And I think, you know, a lot of these conversations that we're having, you know, and also with many other people were, you know, they're sort of taking place over several years. And, you know, and sometimes they take that length of time for them to actually have any, let's say, output or some visible sign that they've, you know, that they formed something. And I'm sort of interested in how that sits within certain kinds of queer methodologies and queer practices. So that a lot of the people I sort of work with in the past, I worked with numerous artists such as James Richards, Jade Montserrat, Hilary Lloyd, Arit Ashery, and each of them sort of speak to different kinds of set of experiences or engender different kinds of practices. You know, and it's a sort of, I would say, like what I call sort of productive drifting. And where it is that sort of searching for the right conditions for something to take place. And so for me, it's about how, as a writer and as an editor, how to sustain those languages or how those places of intimacy might continue when everything feels and often can be quite a fraught place. And I mean fraught in the sense of, you know, overworked, exhausted, underpaid, and all those other conditions that hamper, you know, the idea of actually doing something. So, I mean, I'm sure those kinds of conversations will come out as well through the course of this conversation. I'm also interested as a writer to look at other types of art criticism that, you know, particularly over the past few years, the sort of rise of autofiction and where that sits in terms of art criticism. And I'll be looking at, you know, thinking about that in terms of editing, but how that maybe even sits with the ideas of, you know, this idea of, the idea of autofiction and how that sits with collective practices. And if it's antithetical to those kinds of ideas, even, you know, this sort of return to one's testimony or one's sense of self, and how does that sit within these ideas of more of a dispersed or non-legible identity position? I mean, maybe they're not, but they're sort of, it's interesting to consider these two things, I think. In terms of the Framapad, it was a challenge, I would say, Lina, to sort of work in that format for me initially. I think largely because I'm very used to working with deadlines, and so this sort of open-ended structure to that, it took a while to sort of try to attune to this rhythm of something that you would just dip into, and try and sort of flesh out thoughts over time in a way. And for me, it was sort of, this sort of. I would have liked something maybe in my thinking, maybe something more time related, like we go in at, you know, be between 2 and 5 p.m. on a Friday or something, just to give a sense of connection, because I think sometimes it can feel also quite detached, just to be writing on to a screen. And, you know, it's quite a, you know, as much as it's fascinating and it was a great learning experience to learn, you know, to read everybody's text through that time, but there's something also quite disconnected about just the durational aspect of writing on screen. I think that was one of the thoughts I would have had towards that.
Great, thank you all for that. I think we are all kind of sharing this. Okay, we've got. I'm just gonna turn somebody's mute somebody. Okay, there we go. Okay, I think we all share this this kind of sense of maybe having some resistance to identifying with a particular role or a particular title in the sense that Helena and Chris talked about. But I also see how it can be productive in Gerrie's case. It was interesting that actually something like very much like this came up in the first panel, I think. Where Carolina, who is here, and we can return to this, talked about the kind of productive space between different roles and the kind of shifting of gears across different roles. But I think also it's kind of quite important to sort of think about how it's not just our resistance, but also the resistance to the change that is happening around, changes that are happening around us, as we as people who are involved in all these different activities with different levels of collaboration and kind of crossing over, operate in a very neoliberal, very kind of fast moving field. Our role, we also have to constantly reposition where we are and kind of, and almost like create forms of defense against this co-option and kind of commodification that Helena talked about. And I was just last week sort of talking to colleagues in Macedonia, saying, I think I have a practice, but I don't know what it is. I don't know what to call it, and I don't know where it fits anymore. And as our kind of the relationship to the institutions that maybe once were more kind of willing to accept these forms of operation that we're all doing, as that shifts, I think we also kind of shift and sort of begin to form resistance and to form new ways of thinking about what we are and how we operate and how we kind of protect ourselves somehow from kind of being pushed in directions that are not welcome. But anyway, perhaps that's something we can come back to. But yeah, I was also interested in this in the kind of productive space of resistance against these titles, which maybe later on Carolina can also come in and talk about. So at this point, if I could just ask you to each perhaps point to a couple of discussion points or sort of areas that you found to be interesting in the Framapad, and maybe say a little bit more, or anything that you think should have been explored more that, you know, has more potential for discussion. So shall we go back to Helena?
Sure. And just to say, I think, Gerrie, you kind of claiming the visibility of editor, curator of publications is exactly in line with my desire to retreat from other roles, because I think it was largely around the branded curator that I was becoming really put out, and it kind of relates to what's come up in some of the other panels. I think it was in the first week somebody brought up Howard Becker's book Art Worlds, you know, which talks about an art ecology comprising so many participants, from, you know, the person who created the canvas for the painting to be rendered on, to the gallerist who sells the work, to the art critic or the philosopher who defines the aesthetic terminology within which an artwork has meaning and value. And I think my concern was that, you know, not that we shouldn't claim our roles or our work or be recognized for our work, but that certain kinds of work is valued and privileged, and other behind the scenes work is completely invisibilized. And I would say actually one of the interesting aspects of our conversation on the Frammapad, which I don't think was intended, but was around editing. We got into quite an interesting discussion about editing as a kind of, I think, under-recognized practice, and whether it could be equated to care, whether it could be equated to care of the writer's work, but also it's sometimes being an antagonistic relationship. So that was a bit, sorry, something's funny happening with sound. Somebody need to be muted? I'm not sure. Okay. So I think that was a part of our Frammapad that I enjoyed because I wasn't expecting it. What I primarily contributed to the Frammapad was, I think, to offer two definitions of kind of assumed identities within an contemporary art context. And the first being with the Guerrilla Girls, or Industria as a current example, being good examples. So where groups of individuals come together and operate under either an assumed name of an individual or a group in order to kind of call out inequities and injustices and exploitations, but with the protection of anonymity. And we decided that that was often when there was quite a clear kind of agenda or activist goal in mind. And the other kind of approach was that of artists like Rena Spaulding's or Claire Fontaine, where the invention of a character or the appropriation of a name is a way of not limiting artistic production to an individual, recognizing it as an artist's name as including numerous entities and agencies. In the case of Claire Fontaine, I quoted an interview they'd given where they said that they hoped that numerous others would collaborate with Claire Fontaine, would become part of Claire Fontaine. But in fact, it ended up only being the two initiators, James Thornhill and Fulvio Carnevale, because in the end, it proved difficult for others to have the degree of commitment to working as Claire Fontaine's assistants, as Thornhill and Carnevale sometimes call themselves. It was a very high level of commitment that others weren't in the end able to bring. So, Gerrie.
It's nice that you pick up on that again, because I think as you were talking, as we come back to that notion of commitment, and for me that then points at what do we expect when we say we collaborate, we are a collective, and there seems to be a kind of like, yeah, quite undefined, and I'm sure that a lot of collectives and a lot of collaborations do have a kind of like memorandum of understanding and make it work. But there is also, and I think I ended up sort of talking about that sometimes, and particularly the collectives that are more linked to what we would call institutional critique, that reflect on the machinations and the systematic kind of connections and interrelationships between different parties within the art world, that the energy sort of sits within the art world, and there's maybe less resonance with wider societal concerns. Whereas if we are talking about indeed concerns that like indeed representation of women or people of color in other whatever kind of cause that is also active as a point of attention and something that people can gather behind in wider society, there is more energy to sustain that. I think also when we think about collective, and I think that example of Claire Fontaine is like wanting to draw other people into the collective, but people finding it difficult to sort of share that commitment over a longer period of time, is indeed that question, well, how do we see collaboration to unfold over time? Is it something where we're all expecting to input all in the same way continuously or in the long run? Or could we see collaboration as something where indeed there are individuals within the collective and we're happy to pass on and then dip back in and pick back up? The word ecology was mentioned, and I've recently, in the last couple of years, been really thinking about indeed the limitations of terminologies. So I'm come back to a notion of ecology, but particularly as formulated by Isabella Stengers, Belgian philosopher who's come up with the notion of ecology of practices. And when we look at the art world indeed as an ecology of practices, different kinds of practices of interdependence, then we could think about our own practice, however sort of like multifaceted and amorphous it is, in which we circulate around different kind of like focus points of, okay, I'm an editor today, I'm an educator tomorrow, but actually what I do in those two roles is closely interconnected in how I fulfill that role. And I think that is one way of thinking about an ecology of practices. But I think when we look at the art world and how we collaborate with others continuously, whatever people's sort of label, job, or perceived position in the field, we continuously dip in and out of intertwinements and networks. So thinking about the fact that we all have a role and multiple roles, we also sort of like move continuously in interactions with other people. And for me, a terminology like ecology of practice, rather than a particular kind of positionality and a particular kind of label, that fluidity and accepting that you pick something up. When I work with an artist and authors and a graphic designer and editors and other people involved, we move things around continuously in the process of producing a publication. And I think that the same applies indeed with artist practices, with curating projects, whether it's a show or something else. It is that sort of accepting that things move around from configurations to other configurations to other configurations. And for me, a term like that opens up that durational but also unfolding. That is a process that continues continuously. I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you. Chris, please.
Sure. I completely echo what Gerrie was saying there in many ways. I think that's sort of the multiplicity or the ecology and the kind of moving between fields, both in editing and publishing, but also how that maybe moves on to both practice and art practice as well is there, and how we articulate that I think has to be worked with over time. I think I want to draw a little bit more towards editing, partly because I feel that that's what's being asked of me. So what I was drawn to is thinking about ideas of the very infrastructure of editing, how and who does that work, and under what conditions. So I was sort of interested in how we actually start determining some of those ideas. And I was also sort of thinking about the history of magazines and sort of looking into that a little bit. And the actual term magazine comes from the Arabic word makzan, meaning storehouse. And so it's interesting just to think of that, you know, how that we think of a magazine as a sort of fixed thing, which it is, and it enables, I think, from a historical perspective, a very useful document in our ability to actually see, you know, adverts, text, image placed alongside one another, and we can kind of judge through that work, or see through that rather, you know, the various fashions or tastes that were part of that era. I think that's something that inevitably is sort of harder to see when we have much more online publications and so on. It's a much more diffuse story that we have. And I say this just from a sort of historical perspective, but it's in my mind. I was also interested by the title of this talk, you know, from Charles Green's book on collaboration and the idea of the third hand, and often how this suggestion of material coming third hand implies a certain distrust, specifically something removed from any direct or trustworthy reference source. I was sort of interested in, because I think this is, you know, this obliquity is sort of interesting. How do we hear or know something? And so it's this hand that sits at the periphery of largely unofficial records, but also that might inform or give direction or subtle shape to the various contours that might make the overall whole. That is perhaps where the place that editing might also sit. And then I also looked at something from Wayne Kirstenbaum, and he considered collaboration and being a collaborator, going on to describe that how in wartime collaborators are traitors who join the enemy, and going on to say that is double writers who bear the stain of the word's political meaning, that they've compromised themselves, have gained new and unhealthy allegiances, and have betrayed trusts. And so I think this idea of, you know, the certain anxiety or an opacity of relations when it comes to collaboration or something unmappable is something, and for Kirstenbaum is erotically or libidinally charged, is something that I was sort of interested or drawn to. And I think we sort of picked up a little bit about that in our Framapad, about, you know, how collectives appear or disappear behind the very things that they're describing. And it is that sort of tension that is also perhaps evident in some aspects of editing. I can say from my perspective as a writer and editor, my relations are often contingent, inconsistent, and often highly charged, sometimes conflictual and personal. And there is a degree of implicit confidentiality in the process of editing. I think if I was to sort of admit or describe something from the editing process, I would feel a betrayal of some kind. You know, one has to keep these kinds of things private. Somehow this, and a lot is on the cutting room floor. You know, I think there's so much material that we've put in the magazine over the years that is so juicy, but ultimately is never, you know, it doesn't exist. It doesn't ever get published. And I think those kinds of things are interesting as well. You know, and also picking up some of the subjects in this discussion, in the overall discussion, the gendered nature of that. I mean, one person that obviously came to mind was Pat Hackett and her editing of Andy Warhol's diaries, and how often only in recent years, she's become more credited for that work. And I think that's true generationally, and still is probably still true, actually. What else can I, such a few notes here. I mean, what else? I see these talks also as like the idea of what the idealism associated with collaborative practices, certainly from the Eurocentric history of romanticized action. And again, to echo some of Gerrie's points, you know, be that through gendered, racialized, socioeconomic, or through sexual orientation reasons, you know, various people have been, you know, sort of written out of parts of history. And it's perhaps no wonder to me that these very people often seek the collective networks of support from each other, equally though they're riven and fraught because of those things. I think, you know, we inevitably find our own networks through those differences. And so I think I also raised through the Framapad the ideas of care and what it means to look after someone's text. And I think that's, you know, that goes to the point really of where these very private, often personal exchanges take place, and how we as writers and editors, you know, we're trying to, what I think Irene's Ravel calls the sort of the sort of the place of stamina, like how much we can kind of endure reading as much as writing. I think, you know, who's got the time to read a 10,000 word document if it's unwieldy, if it's you know, if it's harder to sort of access. You know, an editor can be there to kind of bring that into focus, or bring some of that work for the reader to be able to just kind of access it at a point that perhaps otherwise might not be there. And so I sort of see that work as an editor to try and do that, to try and facilitate a space both for the writer and for the reader, and to try and bring a kind of a sort of an ease, not necessarily in a way that is actually pacifying, but in a way to try and pay respect or give something back to both parties, and to sort of generously open up a conversation and a point of access to a person's work. So there's some of the thoughts I would have. Yeah.
Thank you so much there. Okay, Helena and then Gerrie.
I mean, just as a sort of counterpoint to that, I did a creative writing degree a year or two ago, and one of the exercises we had was we were given 2 versions of a short story by Raymond Carver, who I adore. And one was incredibly pithy and really quite austere and brilliant. And the other was a lot longer. It was a bit softer. It was the same story, but it was much more unwieldy. And we were just asked to read them. And we were asked which did we prefer and which did we think had been written first. And the pithy, austere one was the one that had been published after his editor, Gordon Lish, absolutely decimated Carver's story. He was called a sculptor of prose. And he left about 2/3 of the story on the cutting room floor. And the argument goes that he basically made Raymond Carver, but that's not actually how Raymond Carver wrote. So it was a very fascinating class exercise to realize that what I considered, you know, one of my most revered writers, actually what I was reading was Gordon Lish's version of a decimated Raymond Carver.
Amazing. Gerrie?
Sort of following on, I think both Chris and Helena, so like actually for me again broaden the framework of what we operate within. And I think you mentioned deadlines earlier. As we always see them as terrible, either as detrimental or indeed if they're too open-ended, that's too unwieldy. But time, I want to talk maybe more about time in a generic kind of sense. Sometimes there is scope and time to let indeed collaborations unfold, and to take time for that towing and froing, and to really consider, well, who is this for? What might this be? What do we want it to do in relation to a practice or a series of ideas or an exhibitionary project, whatever it is. And sometimes there isn't that time. And I think the influence of having access to time, or the limitations of time, is also very often a contributing factor, just as indeed the nature of the platform that we're working towards. As in, if you're working for a magazine or a journal, you have a given readership that you're trying to speak to, whereas if you are talking about, okay, well, somebody's practice as an artist, as a collective, or as a set of practices, when it is maybe more a group sort of like endeavor, there are other concerns, if there are time, that tend to be foregrounded in terms of trying to think through what might this be, what is important, does this require shorter text, or do we have scope to give somebody 10,000 words, but the nature of the 10,000 words allows that to sort of sit within maybe shorter. So I think there's a lot of things that are about affordances of either the medium, the framework, the platform, and the affordance of time that sometimes is able to allow a project to unfold. And indeed, if it takes 6 months longer, it takes 6 months longer. I'm in the lucky position that very often people approach me for those projects that I sometimes indeed despise in the process, because they do become those unwieldy, time-eating kind of processes. But it is for me really important very often that that time is there, because it becomes then something else rather than a formulaic kind of, okay, well, we just do it because we have a deadline. So time and indeed letting that unfold as something that really can shape the nature of collaboration greatly, or demarcate it very neatly.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I just want to respond, just following on from what Gerrie was saying, just to respond to this question of structures and deadlines and affordances. I think something that was very difficult in this project is to find a balance between the freedom, the sort of, you know, a lot of time, and also the possibility to do anything, and then the responsibility, and also I have to say some level of guilt towards all the participants, because I didn't want to take your time, you know. So I was constantly, Kat and I were constantly shifting between, should we send another email? No, we shouldn't. We should just let them be. Should we prod people? Should we kind of be more proactive? And I didn't want to be like an annoying teacher going, well, you have not done your Pramapad today. So that sense of, but the question really was that I had this opportunity to bring people together. So what do you do? How do you work with people that you think there's going to be a lot of commonalities, people that you're inspired by, and you want to enter into that conversation with them, but also knowing that we're all up to our eyeballs in work, in admin, in responsibility. So it's been really hard. Of course, the ideal scenario would have been to be in the same space at the same time and somehow structure it in that way. So it was a really kind of difficult choice how to structure this project. And I found that somehow, even though we gave it, in fact, Kat was brilliant at sort of timing it and structuring it, because I was constantly going, oh, we can just do it and it can, you know, be done much quicker. And she kind of made me slow down, and that was great. But we still didn't have enough time. It was still, it was kind of a sort of tension between a pleasure to read the Framapads every day or every other day, and constant guilt, and this thing of all of us saying, oh, I wanted to, I wish I could have, I had other, you know, other ideas, and I wanted, and all of us kept writing, oh, I'll come back to this, or I'm kind of,
it's collective guilt here.
It was collective guilt, and at one point I actually drafted an email saying no guilt, and then I didn't send it. But it is that tension of, you know, and again, something we talked about in one of the panels, which is this balance between paid work and unpaid work, and pleasure, and you know, reading groups and getting involved in kind of projects that make you happy, effectively, that are things, reasons why you do what you do, and then this kind of tension with paid work, and, you know, should I be giving this time, or is this my pleasure, or is this my job? Gerrie.
Yeah. But that brings it back to the notion of commitment, as in how can we commit to collaborative processes? And indeed, in day-to-day reality, we tend to sort of foreground the ones that we're paid for rather than the ones where the pay is less, but actually the process is potentially far more rewarding. Those in my book then tend to also be the projects that draw out over time. But I think that notion of commitment, where how can we commit to a collective endeavor, as in the moment it comes out of a shared concern or a shared agenda or a shared issue, then indeed it galvanizes energy much more quickly. The question is how sustainable is that in the long run, Helena?
I was actually just, one of the things that I've so enjoyed about these discussions is the kind of skeptical approach to collaboration. We haven't assumed in any of the conversations I've been a part of or sat in on that collaboration is necessarily, you know, good or ethical. But I did absolutely love a quote that Carla Cruz offered in the second panel, which was called Why Collaborate, where she was quoting from a group of Portuguese women, a Portuguese collective, and they call themselves the Three Marias. And in 1972, they asked, what do we have at the end of this writing, this collaboration? And the answer, what do we have before? Less, much less. And that just reminded me why I do just so enjoy these kinds of collective explorations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Gerrie?
Well, it reminds me, as in I brought up Rax Media Collective in one of the comments in our Framapad, and I brought them in because they, as a collective, both an artist collective and a curatorial collective, oscillating between those roles, have also very proactively reflected on the notion of collaboration over time. So I've read quite a lot of their writing in that sense, and they're really sort of precise about sort of indeed saying, well, an idea in one head, the moment it is shared with others, it transforms itself and it starts to circulate as a different idea. And for me, that really highlights, indeed, we tend to think about ideas and execution. And in a lot of writing, certainly in the curatorial field, some people have made a very, very clear distinction between, okay, well, those who have the ideas, we foreground, we sort of attribute greater value, and those who execute, do all the legwork in the background, to have a different kind of position and therefore also slightly different value. And that assumes that ideas are static, that they're formulated the moment they're articulated. And I think that that sort of clarity of saying, well, I can put an idea in a group, and by it being taken up in the group and being discussed, the idea transforms and it becomes something else, and it becomes indeed collectively owned and continues to transform the more people surround that idea, work with that idea, help execute that idea. So for me, there's a value in that thinking about that as, okay, you need a seed for something to start, and I think Lina's done that really well within this project. There's a lot of bulbs and seeds here thrown around. Pick them up, and I think the way it's, I think the seeds are not necessarily fully grown, sort of like flower patches yet, but there's a lot that has actually been amassed, and that's where I think sort of thinking about a publication to tease things out further, to see, well, what's the fertile ground that actually we now have here that covers an awful lot, where maybe with a bit more distance further connections can be made. I think is a really interesting as a proposition for a process that embraces that sort of working things around, or throwing things around, moving things around between people in different configurations.
Yeah, but so I'd like to add that in terms of some of Gerrie's points earlier, which was about duration, or the kind of time frame in which we have to produce a work. And I guess I've worked both, I work in relatively short time frames working on a magazine. Sometimes we have very tight deadlines. And then in other ways, I've worked on much longer projects as well. I think both yield their own kind of dynamic and their own kind of energy. Actually, I don't think one necessarily stands above another. I think they both forge a kind of an attempt to try and conceive of something in that moment. And in a way, they both offer different things. Perhaps, one more off the cuff is actually quite useful because that's the period of a magazine. It kind of has this lifespan, and then it disappears again. And I think that's what's sort of affirmative or actually quite useful about that space. So I think each of these different, hopefully these different models present different kinds of useful and purposeful aims. And second to that, the other thing that I would like to have mentioned is about collectives themselves, which for me, they often they come out of a sort of principle of survival, often against certain sort of forms of hardship, or a kind of pragmatic need for materials or knowledge sharing or other kinds of things that perhaps maybe are missing elsewhere. And I think that's why collectives invariably do kind of work together. And I think that's sort of, that's why I think I mentioned, very sort of ACT UP legacies and Grand Fury, queer Queer Nation, Fierce Pussy, all these kinds of activist groups, many of which have their own issues and problems inherent to them, not least with gender and so on, but they all, you know, sort of still present kind of radical viewpoints of access to healthcare, a deep kind of inquiry over, you know, issues around people of color, race, gender, and so on. So it's sort of, you know, I still come back to those kinds of the legacies of that history and find a kind of very fruitful set of models or thinking that sort of comes out of that. And, you know, we still see that today.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring in one thing before we open to the floor. One other point that I found very interesting in the Framapad, which is where Gerrie brought in the analogy of translation, and it's in relation to editing and that intimacy and that kind of joint work of kind of transposing from one language to another. And something you said, Chris, earlier really made me think about actually that intimacy and trust in any form of collaboration, both in relation to collectives and in relation to editing. And it made me think of this novel by Katie Kitamura called Intimacies, and a fascinating passage in which a translator and a war criminal are the only people in court that speak a particular language. So the intimacy between these two people who have never met but are very, very closely collaborating in the process of this trial with everyone else kind of being outside of it. And that's an idea of translation and that intimacy and that process, and how does that live on beyond the process itself? Gerrie.
Yeah, just a reference to throw into the wider group. Kate Briggs' This Little Art About Translation is a beautiful reflection on that. Beautiful read, beautifully written, but also very incisive reflection on the process of translation, which is about literal translation, so linguistic translation. But I think when you read it sort of like with an open mind, there's a lot that can be carried over to other creative situations, working with others to bring something into being in a particular kind of context, in a particular kind of vocabulary and kind sets of practices. It's a really sort of, if people haven't read it, it's a really useful point of reference to go back to.
Thank you. Okay, I think at this point we should invite everyone to come in and switch their cameras on, and we hope to also hear from our others that have been part of the project. So please, do we have any questions in the chat, or does anyone want to come in with a question at this point?
Or do people want to go straight to wine?
Just, yeah. Okay. Hi, Carolina. Okay, I will give everyone a moment for any questions or points. Hi, Carla. Also, by all means, everybody, not just the people who were part of this group, please feel free to turn on your cameras and be visible. In the meantime, maybe I can ask a question to everyone that's participated or who has come to the panels, if you can imagine how we might go forward. So our task for those of us, so we have, I should probably explain at this point. So we have kind of created a self-selected editing group. So people that wanted to be involved and feel they have the time and the possibility to be involved are going to be working together to edit something out of these Framapads. And we should probably say that the Framapads at the moment are very raw, each of them. And actually, I should explain that people in different groups haven't seen each other's Framapads. So that's about to happen. So the next step is that somehow we go from this kind of beautiful chaos into bringing this into some form of a publishable document. And this is actually something that's also come up in the Framapad. To what point is that something we should do? I don't know, Helena, if you want to sort of say anything about that, because you were quite active in that particular strand, just sort of thinking about what does it mean to take something that's been collaboratively authored without, like, these Prabhupats, these conversations are not perfect, they're messy, and they're threads answering threads and sort of comments on the side, and they're full of life, but they're not very easily readable by anyone who wasn't a part of it.
Well, I just raised the issue quite early on as to whether the discussions would be edited. And I did it because I had just come off a group writing collaboration with I think there were about 8 of us. And we would do kind of a bit how Chris was describing. We would meet for a couple of hours and all write sort of furiously and feverishly on this Google Doc. And over the course of maybe 4 meetings, we generated about 20,000 words. And at a certain point, I said, and it was all around kind of care and queer and feminism and, you know, fabulous stuff. And at a certain point, I said, wow, we've got so much. How are we going to edit it? And there was a kind of deathly silence. And the 2 people who initiated it said, oh, we're going to have to think about that. And then they sent everybody an email saying they'd thought about it and they felt that that was an authoritarian gesture to edit, and that they didn't want to destroy the authenticity of the exchange, and that they were going to just publish the whole thing. And it even got down to, and I had at certain points said, oh, I don't mind doing a bit of copy editing. I even got, and I said, you know, what citation system are we using? Because we've all made a lot of references. And the 2 people said, well, everyone has their own way of referencing. We don't have a citation system, at which point I practically exploded and just felt really old-fashioned, because I just wanted things to be shaped. I wanted things to, because I wanted people to read what we'd written. And actually, it was a fantastic exchange, but not at 20,000 unedited words with, you know, repetitions and ramblings and things that it really needed to be reduced by about 2/3 and have a proper citation system. So at that point, I said, no, I wasn't going to. I said, no, it's okay. I'm not going to offer my editorial services, because what's the point? And this thing exists online somewhere. I haven't even shared it because I honestly, like, who is going to read 20,000 unedited words? So I felt that concern with authenticity was entirely at the expense of the readers, or the potential readers.
That in a way, I'm grateful that happened, so that we were able to address that issue head on. We started with that in this panel with that question, and it has actually been a really good thing to discuss, because we've sort of arrived at a I think a solution where we will be 2 to 4 people per panel working on editing, and I hope that we can then go back to the group and kind of solicit any other comments or anything else at all that that, you know, people might want to add or change or add references or anything like that. So I certainly, I don't know about everyone else, but I certainly don't feel that's an authoritarian gesture. But obviously that's something that's contested. Flake has a question or a statement.
I just want to completely thank you, Helena, for telling that story, because I feel like I've been in those situations so many times and felt as you have done. But one of the things that interests me is the way in which, and I think it's to do with time, and I don't know, but when I was working on something years ago that was visual and textual, I realized that I could put bad pictures that I'd made in something and people would cope with that and just turn over the page. But actually, if I put bad writing in, nobody's going to wait even, you know, a moment to read it. And I think that's really interesting about the difference between the visual and the textual in that way. Anyway, that's a side thing, but it was just a great, you've kind of given a perfect picture of some of the crazy tensions that we have to deal with.
Jimena. Thank you, Flick.
Thank you so much for the panel and the very nice points. I would like to ask Gerrie about, I was attracted to the ecology of practice. Ecology of practices. I just went to check online. And I wonder if you feel that this ecology of practices is something that we can apply in this next step for the editing and the publication, because it's something I don't know very well, but what I'm scanning in what I found is about interdependence, and as a kind of collaboration, but from the ecology. So I would love to know if you have something else to say, or if you are familiarized with that.
I think that's a really interesting idea, and maybe that is something to sort of like discuss, I think, within each group and say, okay, what kind of capacities do we have here? What do we feel is needed to help this shape? Might indeed another kind of practice, or somebody who has maybe a more sort of like articulated or explicit kind of eye or ear or lens, might that be helpful to draw out? So it is about thinking what kind of skill sets do we have collectively here? What do we feel might be beneficial to sort of draw things out? So it's opening up that sort of thinking about, well, who do we want to sort of pass it around amongst, rather than saying, oh, this is what we have in the room. So it is, as in thinking about a lot of things that have come to the fore, it is about sort of indeed allowing, on the one hand, maybe a greater vulnerability as to, okay, you open up the group to a different eye that may come in with different kind of expectations. But at the same time, that also opens the potential for a different kind of moving on, passing on around different kinds of skill sets and concerns and perspectives, which in my view very often is enriching rather than indeed a harsh sort of like cutting. And in that sense, as in my own experience, I'm not going to sort of say much more, but in my own experiences, in a lot of the projects where I've worked, I've done the conversations with a graphic designer or somebody who is, say, the web designer who builds the back end of a website and is aware of the affordances in terms of the particular kind of platform or medium, is often so useful to have in the room, because then you're not talking just about content, you're also thinking through the connection between content and form and platform, and that then becomes a slightly different kind of conversation. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. I think we have a question or point from Carolina.
Yes, thank you. Sorry for the quality of the video. Thank you very much for the panel. I just wanted to share my kind of follow-up thought that for me, publishing of our conversation is also the form of opening up. And that's why it was clear for me that okay, now we talk and now we think of opening up, so we have to make the best form of effort to communicate, and that's all, because it's as you said before, this insider outsider game. So now we are opening up, so let's be generous and don't use globish, for instance, like I do, and just be generous.
Yes, that's absolutely a very good point. I mean, I think the thing with a project like this is that you sort of throw it up in the air and wait to see what comes back. And what has come back has been brilliant. But now I think always probably a little bit stuck in my kind of curator producer role, which is my sort of background. And I always think, can I structure this in a way where everyone is remunerated properly, everyone is paid, everyone is given, given the sort of resources they need? And with this project, I don't know how to do that. So it's again, you come to the question of, is this a labor of love, or is this something we're doing because we, got a small fee for it, or, all of these questions about research and what constitutes research and what counts as research within a university setting, and how we kind of, resist, or do we kind of commodify this? All of these questions are, kind of the next step. So in a perfect world, I would love to we have the pleasure of now taking as long as we want. We don't have a publisher. We can take as long as we want to shape these as much or as little as we want, and make them, to give them whatever shape we choose to. So that's the wonderful thing. But on the other hand, it's again that thing of who are we speaking to? Where do we go from here? I again have that sense of responsibility that I don't want to burden people. I don't want to overwhelm people, but at the same time, I'd like to make something of this very productive time and these sort of virtual spaces that we've created. So it's in a way, so many questions. I mean, my plan is now to sit down, read through everything, and work with those of you who have expressed interest in kind of taking it further. But then on the other hand, also, in a kind of a dream world, try to find some funding that could bring us all together in a space, maybe do something, workshops, I don't know, something in a physical space. But it's again, where does this form of practice fit in increasingly kind of factory-like setting that we're all operating in? I don't know if anyone has a brilliant answer to those questions. I don't know, Helena, if you maybe want to say something about your experience of working in this quite open-ended way with the Feminist Duration Reading Group, which is, of course, one of the inspiration points, having been involved with it over the years.
Yeah, so I've been running a reading group for 7 years, which meets about once a month or so. It's not a closed group. And one of the things we do is read out loud, because that means that people can come without having read in advance. And I suppose it's a funny thing, because it does take up quite a lot of work, because most of what I do is not organize the sessions myself, but support other people to do it. And that just gives me a huge amount of pleasure, because I suppose, I don't know, maybe there's a form of mentorship there, or feeling that I have some kind of institutional access, and that's valuable for certain people. But I also get to learn a lot, because it started from a place of curiosity rather than knowledge. So it started with my interest in Italian feminism, which was actually prompted by working with Fulvia Carnevale of Clairefontaine. And because I was very ignorant about it, I just decided to set up some reading groups to look at some texts that had been translated, mainly written in the 70s and 80s. And then that led to the desire to learn about other kinds of feminisms that weren't canonized, within the Anglo-American tradition, just realizing how much was not disseminated, talked about, and that hierarchy even within feminism itself. So it's also my way to kind of be led by the curiosity of others. So right now we've got quite a lot around like crip theory and access issues. We've also got an interest in sort of Sino-feminisms. Several members who come are from East Asia. So it's also just become a kind of, it's just become active, and it's just a kind of growing entity. Lina's run a session. I don't know what to say about it, really. Every year I think that's it. I'm not going to do it anymore. Because it's not really referable, it's not really, it doesn't really count in like research terms, because what am I doing? I'm organizing a reading group, but it has such a vitality and such a life that it is a labor of love. It's pleasurable. And I have also formed, I suppose it's also about the relationships you form, and perhaps because it is labour of love because it is voluntary labour. The friendships that develop out of it feel kind of quite loose, and we're not really asking anything for each other. It really does operate according to who's got something and who wants to do something, and because it's only once a month, it's regular enough to keep it going, but it's not so much work that it becomes a burden or a job. I don't know, Lina, you've been involved. I don't know if there's anything else that is relevant.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that question of kind of it's a question of commitment. And I think for me, like when I came back to London after years away, I thought I'm going to commit to this one thing because I knew that, like with the Feminist Duration Reading Group, not that I'm very committed, as you know, or very active, but just that sense of like you commit because there's so much all the time. You could be running around doing so many things all the time. So I think that commitment to like somehow one long-term thing is really, really important. But also what I'm struggling with maybe with this is how to protect it from kind of making it into like a work thing, a ref thing, a thing that someone somewhere can commodify and put into statistics. And that's the struggle. Like, I don't know, in a way, if I had a completely different job, if I was a vet or something, it would be brilliant because I wouldn't have that dilemma. But I do with everything I do. It's like, is this a part of it or is this outside of it? And I want to protect it. I don't want, anyone to tell me, oh, and others now needs to get, I don't know, to have certain number of participants or more bigger. I'm not interested in that. And I've always had that problem with protecting like work that I care about with previous work, Electra and everything. It's been very, very difficult. And I don't know, I mean, the whole idea of practice-based research is still very kind of commodified, and that's like the possibility of breaking that apart and kind of taking practice-based research outside of it, outside of these categories, is something that we could maybe all think about. I know Sophie Hope, who is one of my colleagues and one of the participants, is doing great work in that area. But it's kind of like, again, going back to collaboration and care and trust and equity. Like, how do we protect these kind of spaces? So I don't have any answers at all. So I think we've come to a point, unless somebody has any thoughts or questions or points they would like to make. I think we've reached the point where we should probably close. And
Thank
I will.
Lina and Kat, it has been such a pleasure. I've learned a huge amount, and you've just done so much work to keep this platform open and pleasurable. Thank
you all, and well, you'll be hearing from us, and we'll probably send some emails once all the videos are on the website, and kind of inform everyone that's come to these events, whether participating or listening. So the project continues, and we'll go away and think and come up with a clever plan for the publication.